Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the News Project Live. Arnon Mishkin is our guest tonight. He's the director of the Fox News Decision Desk. We'll be discussing how the Fox News Decision Desk is looking at election night. Critical advice for viewers and newsrooms. Our hosts, of course, are Merrill Brown and Alex Leo. Merrill Brown is the CEO of the News Project, and Alex Leo is the head of audience. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Without further ado, Merrill Brown and Alex Leo.
From New York City, I'm Merrill Brown, and welcome to tonight's edition of the News Project Live. We hope we're your kickoff for what is a critical evening in American politics and media coverage. We're 3 hours from the start of the presidential debate. To our live audiences, please be in touch with us during the show, and please encourage your friends and colleagues and other social contacts who couldn't join us live to check in on the show later on YouTube or at our site, thenewsproject.net. Tonight, co-host Alex Leo and I won't be focused on the important debate that's coming up. We'll be focused on election night, 12 days from today. We welcome Arnon Mishkin, who on that night and in the days running up to November 3rd, will be one of the nation's most closely watched analysts of election night polling in his role as director of the Fox News Decision Desk. We're looking forward to debriefing Arnon on the polls of the moment, but even more importantly, we're looking to Arnon to help us understand how concerned citizens and as people running challenged newsrooms, we should look at election night and how we should assess results as they come in, particularly from exit polls. And we'll ask Arnon about how, as an objective analyst, he looks at the often conservative, pro-Trump positions he hears from those in the Fox News primetime lineup. At our company, The News Project, we're working to build technology and services to help small to medium-sized newsrooms address the product and business challenges facing the news today. Our work has ranged from a news site in Brooklyn to a national art site to one of California's most influential news outlets. More on our work later in the program when Alex Leo and I provide you with a look at TNP. Alex joins us tonight from her home in Washington, D.C. Good evening, Alex.
Good evening, Merrill, and thank you to everyone watching at home. Thank you for tuning in. Please tell us where you're watching from and submit your questions for Arnon. We'll ask them later in the show. Merrill?
Thanks, Alex. The challenge that's ahead for our guest and the Fox News Decision Desk are magnified by unprecedented attention on their election night work. The New York Times, for instance, headlined a recent story about Arnon and the news desk as follows. Trump wants to discredit the election. This nerd could stop him. That references to Arnon, our guest. Fox News, the president's favored network, will face enormous pressure to call the election for Mr. Trump. The outcome rests on a little-known 63-year-old who will declare the winner, so said the New York Times. Or here's the Slate, even more blunt headline. The Fox News Decision Desk controls the fate of democracy. Well, overstated for sure, but all this comes against a backdrop of very emotional debate about the role of Fox News in our political sphere and whether the highly opinionated, controversial primetime hosts on the network are improperly altering public awareness of key issues like the pandemic and creating issues as the debate about the validity and importance of Biden's son's work with foreign companies. Our principal focus tonight, however, is on election night and Arnon's role. He's a longtime political and strategic consultant, having been a partner at two consulting firms, Boston Consulting Group and Mitchell Madison Group. Arnon, we are pleased to welcome you tonight. You've consulted for many media companies. You've been an informal friend and advisor to the News Project, and we appreciate that. We should also note that you have a bachelor's from Yale University and an MBA from Harvard, and that certainly has influenced your approach to business and to polling. Arnon, we're pleased to welcome you. Before we dive in, how's life for you in New York City in terms of COVID and your ability to prepare for what's ahead November 3rd?
Well, life is clearly, COVID has clearly affected everybody's work throughout the nation. Our team historically is from all across the country that come in on election night. We brought them in roughly 2 weeks earlier than usual, mainly because of the restrictions on some of the travel and for some of the people who come from Wisconsin, Texas, Florida, and the like have had to be sure to be, quarantined for a few days, as well as get COVID tests before they're allowed in the building. Right now, however, we have basically the entire team that's coming from places that have been hard hit by COVID or currently are hard hit by COVID. In New York, in the building. We are in the building in a socially distant manner, so we're all sort of 6 or more feet apart. We all wear masks, but we have been able to sort of work together over the past week after working remotely for so many weeks. Our system is working, and we are ready to go for election night. Ready to look at the data as it comes in, both from the Associated Press and from the NORC at the University of Chicago.
Arnon, how do you react to the level of scrutiny and pressure that comes with media attention and obviously the heated nature of this election?
Well, I think this is, in many respects, most Americans would agree that this is the most important election of their lifetime. If you look at the numbers from the beginning of the year, the number of people who were extremely interested in this election was north of 50%. That is a number that, and oftentimes 60 or 70%, that is a number that historically doesn't get achieved in most presidential elections until October or November. We were there in January and February.
There you go.
And the second thing is recently, the percentage of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, who believe that, yes, indeed, democracy is on the ballot in November. In the most recent Fox News poll, that was, I think, north of 60% for Republicans and north of 70% for Democrats. This is a highly competitive and a highly tense election for both sides.
Arnon, with 12 days to go, Biden appears to have a lead in the national polls. 2 weeks ago, you assessed the race as being a referendum on Trump. Is that still your view? And what have you seen since that can tell us maybe where the race is headed?
Yes, I think that the election continues to be a referendum on Donald Trump and his presidency. All re-elections are, to a certain extent, referenda on the incumbent. This one does seem to be more so, and most challenging for the president. He has tried to make the election more of a choice between, do you want me to continue or would you prefer Joe Biden to be president? Mm-hmm. And to date, he has not been able to. And so I looked at data. If you look at the percentage, we asked people, are you voting for your candidate or against the other guy? And if you look at that, amongst Donald Trump voters, the vast majority are voting for their candidate. Amongst Joe Biden voters, the vast majority are voting for against Donald Trump. Right. And so we did a sort of a rough calculation. It was basically almost 70% of America, I'd argue, is voting on Donald Trump, and 30% is voting on what they think of Joe Biden, positive or negative.
Arnon, a well-known analyst who I'm sure you know well, and I assume respect, Charlie Cook, now says he thinks the Senate could wind up with a Democratic majority that could include a total number of Democrats, even in the high 50s. How does that assessment strike you?
I think that's very reasonable. I think I think it's reasonable to believe that there is understand that in my business, I am not in the business of guessing what's going to happen. I'm in the business of forecasting a range of what's going to happen. And within that range, making sure that our tools on election night will be capable of responding and assessing any of those scenarios. And the scenario where many of these Senate races, which are currently look 50-50, go one way or the other, which is to say potentially for the Democrats, and they wind up in the high 50s, that's very clearly within the range of possibility. Also within the range of possibility is where everything goes the other way, and the Republicans hold on to the Senate, maybe not by quite as much as they have in the Senate today, but by enough to have a majority.
What are the races, the Senate races, Arnon, that as you're thinking about this on election night will tip your hand in terms of really thinking where the balance sways?
Well, I think the races where it does seem that the Democrats have a clear advantage in terms of winning over Republican seats, I'd say include Arizona for sure, Colorado, Iowa, Maine, and then there are a number of races where it's sort of, who knows what's going to happen. It's sort of 50-50 races, and you can see it going either way. Include Montana, Alaska, South Carolina, and the 2 Georgia races. Georgia I put at the bottom of the list because in the case of Georgia, there is a need for the winner to get over 50%. I would say the most likely scenario on election night is nobody gets over 50%, and there's a runoff in January. And in the runoff, I think that you have to say that the Republicans may have an advantage because it's still a red state, Georgia.
Right. Arnon, there are viewers out there who are understandably turned off by Fox's primetime shows, who see a serious lack of accuracy and presence of propaganda there. Why should they trust Fox's election night coverage versus their normal primetime coverage?
Okay, so the primetime schedule at Fox is the opinion part of Fox. And, you know, the great thing about opinion is everyone can have an opinion. I'm sure within our audience, there are a lot of people who actually also watch Fox and love it. I will tell you that election night is run by the news division at Fox. The mission on election night is to tell our audience, and our audience has the same interest as any other audience. It really doesn't matter how people vote. On election night, you have one question on your mind: who's going to win this thing, and what does it mean? And I think that our audience is tuned to Fox to figure out accurately who is going to be the winner of this election and why they've won. And that's the mission, and it's been very clearly stated from the leadership of Fox News, from all the key Fox News reporters who are on that show and are leading that show, that the goal is figure out who has won this thing and let's report accurately what's happened.
Great. Merrill.
Arnon, let's go back to 2012, a moment in time when you received enormous notoriety, and that was when Karl Rove suggested that Ohio had moved in a certain direction in conversation with Megyn Kelly live on the set that evening. And as we see in the illustration here, Megyn famously wandered down from her glorious set to your cramped basement to ask you the reality of the Ohio situation. Tell us about that night, and is it possible something that dramatic will happen again?
I don't know if something that dramatic will happen. I think that, you know, at the time that we made the call in Ohio and the team made the call, I believe in the top line, the summary of the state, Obama was slightly ahead of Obama was slightly ahead of Romney. You could look at the top line and think this race could go either way. In fact, the data we were looking at, which was by geography, showed very clearly that all the Republican areas of the state, particularly the southwestern parts of the state and the southeastern parts of the state, which were sort of the Republican areas, had reported their vote. The areas of the state that hadn't reported their vote were the northeastern parts of that state, particularly Cuyahoga County, which is to say Cleveland. And so we knew that what we were looking at was the Republicans. We'd counted basically all the Republican vote there was. All that was left was some Democratic vote. I don't think Karl actually had seen those internals. And so I think that was why he thought that Romney still had a chance. I think that the Romney people themselves believed that they had wired the state of Ohio, and they had this tool called Orca, which was going to be their get out the vote tool, computerized get out the vote tool, which they thought was going to carry them to victory in Ohio. Well, it didn't work that night, and they didn't know that at the time. They still thought it was working, and they still thought they had a lot of vote there. They didn't, and so that at the time of that call, we were extremely comfortable with the call. I'll admit to a couple of seconds when I heard that there were a lot of pushback on it. where I thought, oh, that was interesting. But when we looked at the data, it was really clear that there was no way that Romney could catch Obama that night in Ohio. And that's why we said what we said.
So
I came off as like the classic nerd, and it worked from a television perspective.
So there's a version of that scenario on November 3rd, Arnon, which has really outspoken primetime opinion hosts reluctant to buy into the election scenario, or feeling passionate about what's to come, or perhaps raising questions about exit polls on air. How do you see yourself responding to that, and is that actually a risk?
I don't feel that the specific scenario you just outlined is a real risk. First of all, remember that we do not use the exit polls anymore at Fox. We developed a new tool, which we call the Fox News Voter Analysis, which is a survey of over 100,000 Americans. And it's a single tool that will be contacting voters and as well as non-voters, but all types of voters. It's the same tool. We will measure how election day in-person voters are voting, how early in-person voters are voting, and most important, how early mail-in voters are voting. And that will enable us to get a pretty good estimate of how that vote looks. I don't know if it'll be enough, because it's a function of how the vote turns out to make a call, but it will be enough to give us some characterizations. Now, I know that the exit poll guys are doing a better job than they have historically, and they've invested heavily in additional phone polls to get the mail-in voter to assess that. But I will say that for us, we'll be relying on this tool, which we think will be extremely helpful. And we'll be very careful, as I think all the other networks and the Associated Press will be, to make certain that what we're looking at and what we're reporting out is as accurate as can be, but what the count will be at the end of the night. And that's what is going to that's the big uncertainty this year. Historically, there's always been a mail-in vote. Historically, the early vote in 2016 was 40% of the total vote, and only 60% voted in person on election day. This year, it looks like less than 40% of American voters will go to the polls on election day. 60% will either have voted in person early or have voted by mail. And that's a very different situation. And the other thing that makes it complicated, and this is what makes it most complicated, is if you look at all the polls, it is clear that there's an article of faith for Democrats that they should be voting early or they should be voting by mail. And there's an article of faith amongst Republicans that you should vote only on election day, that's the only proper way to vote. And you see that in the numbers, and the skew is much bigger than it historically was. And that will make our job a little more complicated than usual, because you never know what will not always know what you're looking at. Are you looking at a pile, if you will, of early vote or mail-in vote, or are you looking at a pile of election day vote? If you're looking at a pile of early vote, you know that vote is going to be skewed to the Ds more than the average at the end of the night. If you're looking at a pile of election day vote, you know that's going to be skewed to the Republicans more than the actual vote.
Arnon, this is fascinating, and we want to get further into it. But first, I want to say hello to some of our viewers. Sam from Ars Technica and Art, they're both watching on Twitter. Mark Walsh and Bill Seamring are watching on YouTube. Thanks, Mark. And our great friend Aparna, who's on Facebook, watching from Beverly Hills. Merrill, before we move on, can you tell our viewers a little bit more about what we do at TNP?
Alex, absolutely. Well, one thing that we do is we work collaboratively, Alex being a really important part of our team, handling lots of the relationships we have with important websites and dealing with audience growth issues. That's a really important part of our set of services. But in addition to that, what we are in many ways is a platform. We have built a great piece of technology that is included within it everything you need to operate a news site effectively and hopefully in a way that is profitable. That includes technology, that includes revenue services, that includes editorial. We've built 70 templates that are perfect for operating news stories and publishing them. So we think we're the best one-stop shop for people starting new sites or operating new sites that continue to grow. And we'd love to hear from you about it. There's a list on the screen of the services we offer. It includes technology. It includes registration services or quote unquote paywalls. It includes business intelligence and insights. We help people with business development. So please be in touch with us. Either write to Alex at alex@thenewsproject.net or write to me at Merrill at thenewsproject.net. We'd love to hear from you about your businesses, how we can help you. And if you're considering starting a news site, there are many undercovered communities and topics we'd love to help you start sites about. Please be in touch with us. We'd love to work you through the models and how all that might work. Alex?
Thanks so much, Merrill. So Arnon, I want to go back to what we were just talking about before we took a little break there, and mail-in voting. So can you tell our viewers a little bit about when they start counting the mail-in votes, if you think that that will delay the results on November 3rd, or when you think we can expect results overall as a result of this new kind of percentage of people voting by mail?
As with everything having to do with election night and elections in America, the answer is it depends. Remember that an American presidential election is not a single election. It is really 51 different elections, or even more if you think about the way Nebraska and Maine count their vote and allocate their electoral votes. It's 50 different states that each have their own rules, as well as the District of Columbia. That's how we get to 51. Each state has different rules on who can cast and send in a mail-in vote, and also, most important, when those votes can begin to be processed and begin to be counted. In the states that have had the most experience with mail-in votes, states like Florida, Arizona, California, they do some processing of the ballots and also, in some cases, counting of the ballots before election night, before election day. And in those states, you'll get a pretty good dump of the early vote early in the night. But at the same time, particularly in Arizona and California, and in many of the states that are this year experiencing enormous growth in mail-in, you're going to get a lot of that mail-in vote counted later in the evening. And we are going to look very carefully, but obviously for each state, we know the rules of how they count the vote and what that means. In the event that you have an exceedingly wide margin between the candidates in any given state, and again, it's not the margin nationally we're interested in, it's the margin in a state, then most likely we will be able to figure out who has won that state on election night. Okay. In the event that it's a closer election, particularly in many of these states, and in the event that it's a state that has not had as much experience with counting the mail-in ballots, it may take a few days to figure it out. And that will affect whether or not America will know by Wednesday morning who the next president is, or whether or not we'll have to wait a few days, as we've done in the past and for a number of different elections.
Arnon, let's set the scene a little bit for our audience about what you're going to be looking at election day. So what are you doing that day? What data are you looking at during the day that we're not going to have access to? And what should we be looking for? What will you be looking for once we can start talking about data and you can start sharing with us that will be barometers of where you think the election is headed?
Okay, so on that day, we'll a group of us from the decision team at Fox will be locked in what we used to call the quarantine room, but we're now calling the embargo room because it's less confusing. And we will be looking at the incoming results of the Fox News voter analysis. We'll be looking at that along with our partners at the Associated Press. They call it the AP Votecast. We call it Fox News voter analysis. And we'll be assessing what we're seeing in terms of our survey of voters and non-voters, mail-in and in-person voters, and what the implications of that are. At roughly 5 p.m., and by the way, for the other networks who are using the exit poll and their phone polls, they will similarly be locked into similar sort of quarantine rooms, or maybe they've also changed the name to embargo rooms. And at 5 p.m., each of us give briefings that are off the record, sort of background briefings for all the reporters and anchors at our respective networks, where we explain what it is we're seeing. We tell them the trends we think we're going to be seeing, and we also say where we don't know, because in many respects, you'll see on a survey that when a survey shows that a race is 52-48, you don't know how that thing is going to turn out. It's a little bit more likely it'll turn out for the 52, but you should never report that as so-and-so has a lead. You report that as a slight edge or some such thing. And we try to sort of give them a appropriate background on that.
And Arnon, let me follow up on that before we go to Alex with some viewer questions. So what is it at dinner time or late in the afternoon that you're going to see that's going to be maybe an aha moment for you, where you're going to say, this is really telling and important, and we need to wrap our heads around the implications of this?
Okay, so...
I mean, is it Florida? Is it men? Is it what is going to strike you? Do you see?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think that let's just talk about what people have seen in the data. Okay, right now Joe Biden is ahead in the polling averages in Florida. He's competitive in Ohio. He's competitive in Texas. He's sometimes even ahead in Georgia. If any of those 4 states go to Joe Biden, it becomes really difficult to figure out how to get Donald Trump to 270 electoral votes and have him win re-election. Similarly, for Joe Biden, if he cannot basically clear the table in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, maybe also Arizona, it becomes really hard to see how to get him over 270. And so I think that those are the states that we really want to see. Right now, it looks like in those 3 northern states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, Biden seems to have a healthy lead, but we want to see if he keeps it. And in those southern states, though, and Ohio, which are the sort of must-win states for Donald Trump, we want to make sure he's able to keep that lead. To the extent that any of those answers goes south from where the candidate wants it, you have a pretty good indication of what the results of the election are going to be. And so those are the states I think that will be most interesting to us early in the day, and as we're trying to get that. And similarly on the Senate races, we'll be looking at each individual race individually, but we want to see sort of on those races that are sort of 50-50, who knows how they're going to turn out. We want to see what's really happening, and because that is often an indication. If Lindsey Graham is having trouble in South Carolina, that tells you something about the Senate races where we think the Democrat already is favored. I've seen some polls in Alabama where I think most people expect the Democrats to lose a seat with Doug Jones against Tuberville, but but I've seen some polling, but maybe it was internal Democratic spin that said Doug Jones is really close. If he's really close on election night, that's a big challenge for the Republicans.
Interesting. All right, before we go to a viewer question, I want to say hi to Jim Roberts, friend of the show, who chimed in to say good stuff. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
So one of our viewers wrote in, and this was about, so when you were discussing, if it's early voting, we know that's going to skew Democrat, voting day off, we know we're going to skew Republican. And he is asking our viewer, for Arnon, how would they know which state is reporting mail-in vote versus election day vote? Like, do they tell you when the tally comes in which part of the vote it is?
I told you the answer is always it depends.
Okay. Gotcha.
And this is the challenge, okay? In some states, and again, it's not just it's not a statewide decision, it's a county decision. In some counties, what you're looking at are the advance vote, or what you're looking at is the election day vote. In other places, you really don't know. And that's going to make election night fun, is one word for it. Challenging is another word for it. And that's actually why I'm pleased that we have the Fox News voter analysis, because I think that'll be a good guidepost to see how the vote should turn out, and early in the night to sort of calibrate how it's really working.
We'll return to viewer questions and viewer call outs shortly. Please let us know where you are, where you're watching the show from. I know we have Beverly Hills and New York and all sorts of places in between watching tonight, but please let us know. We'd welcome that, and we'd welcome those questions. We still have time for viewer questions, but please reach out to us. We were talking about, mail in and the differences here. And I don't think we're entirely clear on how that changes your job, Arnon, in terms of, normal totals of mail in and absentees and so forth. Does that make it harder, easier, or again, is it complicated?
No, actually, it's not. That one is not a complicated question to answer. It makes it harder. Basically, we have grown from election night to election night, accustomed to the idea that in many of these states, there's an early dump of mail-in vote, and then at the end of the night, there may be some mail-in vote in a few states, Arizona and California. Historically, it didn't matter in the presidency, but at the end of the night. What makes this different is all the models, statistical models we build, are based on a very simple assumption, which is that what you're looking at on the vote in any given county is what you're going to be seeing throughout the night. So when we see a county reporting 20% of the vote and it's 60-40 for the Republicans, say, we basically know that you can multiply those numbers by 5 and you'll figure out what it is at the end of the night. And that's all the models are built on that assumption. The magic comes in the error term you apply to it if you really want to get into the inside baseball. But that's the assumption that all those models, and it's not just the models that Fox uses, it's the models that the folks at the NEP use, and it's the models that have worked in American politics basically since the 1960 election.
Speaking of models, Arnon, let me ask you about one thing that certainly frustrates a lot of people and did in 2016. And that was this question of percentage likelihood of winning, which everyone said, it seemed, was 80-90% for the candidate that didn't win in 2016. And once again, one of your rivals, and certainly somebody with a high profile, Nate Silver, and I think a number of other people are saying the chances of Joe Biden unseating the incumbent president, President Trump, is 84%, I think was the last thing I saw from Nate Silver. What do you make of that data? And I doubt that you think there's an 84% chance that President Trump is going to lose.
As I said, I'm not making estimates at this stage.
But you don't ever, right? And shouldn't we be really leery of these percentages that we see in front of us? 2016 should have told us something about that.
I think that the challenge or the mistake that people made in 2016 was, I know I'm in the minority here, but I don't think it was a polling mistake so much as it was an analytic mistake. So first, in terms of the polling, the national polling estimated a 4-point race, that Hillary Clinton was up by about 4 points or a little less than 4 points. She wound up winning the popular vote by a little north of 2 points. So that's not a bad poll, okay, or not a bad polling average. In the individual states, if you look at the big surprise states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average at the end of the campaign, in all 3 states, that average, even though there were very few polls and many of the polls weren't that good, that average nailed Hillary Clinton's number. What the mistake that was made was people didn't realize that the undecideds were a significant number and that they were all going to swing in one direction. I would say I was one of the people who said, this guy Trump has a better chance than people realize, because and the reason for that was because he was getting decimated by the press. He had scandal after scandal, the Access Hollywood tape, and etc. And each time those scandals occurred, people would report Hillary Clinton's lead has grown. Her lead had not grown. Her number stayed the same, that people went from Trump to an undecided position. And so I kept saying, these people might be able to come back to Trump. If they haven't, The fact that she hasn't won them over, despite all this horrible press that Trump is receiving, that is a bad sign for Hillary. And if you looked at Hillary, she was always in the low to mid 40s maybe, and Trump was in the high 30s, maybe the low 40s, a little behind her, but there was still a huge undecided. If you look at the numbers now, Joe Biden in many of these states is at 50 or just south of 50. He has the lead, maybe the same that Hillary had, but it's a case where he seems to be in a slightly stronger position than Hillary is, because the undecideds are fewer, and even if Trump wins them, wins the bulk of them, Biden still has a healthy place.
But let me come back to you for just a second, Arnon, on this question of this percentage game. You don't do it in part, I assume, because you don't buy it. And yet we're seeing it again. And, you know, it's hard to listen to you talk about the averages here and the likelihood and believe that Joe Biden has an 85% chance of winning. What's behind the methodology in getting those percentages into the public discussion?
Well, I think in 2016, the mistake, as I said, the mistake people made was they focused on the difference between the candidates rather than the individual numbers. I think you need to look at all three numbers, the Democrats' number, the Republicans' number, and the difference, which includes obviously the undecideds. There are many fewer undecideds right now. Biden does have a fairly healthy number. In other words, close to 50% in almost enough states for him to get to 270. So I don't buy that the change could be quite as dramatic as it was in 2016. I don't dislike these models. I think that some of them, you know, don't include enough uncertainty, particularly early in the case. But you know, I think that the reality is that Joe Biden is the favorite, but that there is a path for Donald Trump to win the presidency, and it's a narrow path. I'd argue it's a little narrower than it was in 2016, but it is there. And, you know, remember that if you only have a 15% shot or a 20% shot of winning, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 7 times, your horse will.
That's right. So I want to get to a few of our viewers. Steve Wilson says, great analytical insights from Arnon Mishkin. Aparna says, fun election night, feels optimistic. Corey Salka is watching from Phoenix. Hi, Corey. Peter Kraslovsky, one of our loyal viewers, is there from Southern Oregon. Hello, Peter. And Steve Wilson writes, any deeper insights on Florida?
Florida is, I'm going to be really interested in what happens in Florida. So there are a couple of things. Florida, there are 3 sort of key groups that will be very important for the president and very important to sort of figure out what's going on. Those 3 groups, I would argue, are the folks in sort of the panhandle, the sort of white working class, which were a key constituency for Donald Trump and have been a key constituency. But many of these groups, you know, they continue to be for him, but not by as much as they were in 2016. They don't seem to hate Joe Biden the way they hated Hillary Clinton. Right. The second key group, and arguably the most interesting group, is going to be Hispanic voters. I think, you know, in Florida, it's inappropriate to label Hispanic voters by the one label Hispanic, because people whose heritage is Cuban tend to vote very differently than people whose heritage is Puerto Rican, and people whose heritage is other parts of Latin America. And also then there's the Jewish vote in South Florida that can be very important and that was helpful to Donald Trump, and it's unclear what's going to happen this time. And to me, the most interesting thing we're going to look at is how does the Hispanic vote turn out? One of the things we're very fortunate to have with the Fox News voter analysis, by virtue of the sheer number of people we're going to be interviewing, we are going to be able to sort of ask people not just if they are Hispanic or non-Hispanic, but also what their national heritage is. So we'll be able to assess, and this will be true nationally, assess whether or not there are differences between how Cuban Americans vote versus how Venezuelan Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, and Mexican Americans, or Puerto Ricans, not Puerto Rican Americans, but Mexican Americans vote, because I have a feeling we're going to see that, that everyone knows the traditional difference that Cuban Americans tend to be much more conservative, much more likely Republicans than other Hispanic Americans. But I think we're all also going to see the differences between Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and the like.
We have another viewer question or two, but first I want to just ask you one thing about something you tweeted last week, Arnon, and that is you made the point that with so many Trump voters voting later than Democratic voters, it was likely that breaking news would influence them more than Democrats. Do you see anything that resembles a meaningful October surprise? Do you have any reason to believe the furor about Hunter Biden or Trump's debate behavior or anything that's in the immediate gestalt around the election is going to influence those voters on election day?
Okay, so that insight actually I stole from Joe Trippi or from his podcast. If you're going to steal from anyone, you should steal from Trippi. I didn't quite. I mean that it changes the dynamic of a campaign, and that in particular it means that early in October, if you're a Democrat, you want to focus on motivation and getting your folks out to vote and send in their ballot. And late in the campaign, you want to focus on persuasion, because you're speaking to the weak Biden voter if you're a Democrat, or the weak Trump voter. Now, so that's a nice abstruse inside baseball remark. So today, Joe Biden, who last week was going on, I mean, he didn't say I'm going to pack the court, but there was a lot of stuff from the Democrats about how if we win, we need to make sure we do something about the courts, and the Republicans have been packing the courts, and so now it's our turn, was basically the theme of the day. Today, it came out that Biden, in a TV interview, said he wants to have a bipartisan commission look at how to manage the court system, because the courts have become too extremists on either side. So to me, that was exactly that strategy in action, where I banked the vote of the people who want to pack the court. And now I'm going to speak to the weak Biden voters or the weak Trump voters, and I'm going to say, I'm not into packing the court. I'm into a bipartisan commission for how to address this. And I thought that was particularly interesting, coming from the campaign that I think most smart politicians have been saying has been tone deaf all throughout the campaign, throughout their sweeping the Democratic nomination and now looking like they're in a pretty healthy position for November.
What effect? So we have a question from Art8641, a friend over at Twitter. What effect would Trump declaring victory or fraud have at Fox News?
I mean, we're going to report what the vote says and what the vote means. I think, frankly, I think there's a bit of stuff that comes from not quite the swamp fields of both sides in terms of what Trump's going to do or whatever. That, in the end, the Electoral College, we define how the electors are allocated by state based on what the real data is. Those electors are chosen, are then send in their ballots. They're opened up in early January, and whoever gets north of 270 gets inaugurated on January 20th and becomes the commander-in-chief. And so the notion that after noon on January 20th, Donald Trump can say, I call on the military to do this, doesn't strike me as a reason. If he has not won the election, it doesn't strike me as a reasonable possibility. But I could be wrong.
So we have a comment from Seth Rogen, not to be confused with the other Seth Rogen, but he says, nothing like a little inside baseball from the great Arnon Mishkin. This kind of informative civil discussion is what is missing elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Seth.
He's a cousin of yours, I gather, or a family member? No, Seth, like a lot of our viewers, is a major figure in the industry, worked at the New York Times for many years, and is one of the smartest guys about news that's out there. We also have among our viewers today, our viewers and listeners, Bill Siemering, who's the founder of National Public Radio, and any number of really interesting media people who are debating in the chat a number of things you've said, Arnon, including the fact that the press was tough on Trump in 2016, which has yielded a long discussion, especially among people who have actually the exact opposite view, that the press was not tough on Trump in 2016, and that's one of the reasons he was elected. But we'll come to that over a beer. And
let me just say that I'm not going to. I understand that viewpoint, and I certainly understand the kind of media attention he was getting for his rallies. I frankly agree with Peggy Noonan that the reason he was getting all those attentions was because he was what Gore Vidal used to say about Richard Nixon, that you couldn't take your eyes off him because you'd hear him speak and you'd expect at any minute, like the forehead would open up and like a little cuckoo would come out and say, cuckoo. And that basically the reason he was programmed on CNN and the other places was because people thought tonight is the night he really does lose it all. And
right.
So that's why, and yes, he was getting a lot of attention, and they're absolutely right. That did help him. What I'm talking about is all the stories that were coming out about the tapes, etc.
Alex, anything else from the audience you want to highlight?
No, I just want to say thanks to everyone for tuning in. I also had missed Al Olson watching from Seattle. Thanks to telling us where you're watching from, everyone. Thanks for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Arnon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Arnon, I actually have one more question for you, which is appropriate for tonight. And I said at the beginning we're going to talk about tonight, but let's do so anyway. Is there something from your point of view you're looking for from tonight that would be particularly influential in these last 10 days?
I think look, right now, Joe Biden has been counseled by his team that be cool and you'll be fine. And just make sure that he doesn't set you off. Trump has the much bigger challenge because first he has to force Biden to make a major gaffe to sound completely incapable of doing the job. Something that they've been trying to do for months, and challengingly for them, they've not been successful. The other thing that Trump has to do is come up with a real closing message to articulate to his base, and not just his base, but the people who are weak Trump voters, who were really important in 2016, for why they should come home. And I have not seen evidence that the stuff they're doing about Hunter Biden, much as they've been doing a lot of it, is going to have much impact. And for some reason, that the issues that were so effective for Trump in 2016, which I would list as trade and immigration, are issues that seem to be forgotten by the president for whatever reason. And frankly, I don't get it. This has nothing to do with how anyone votes. It's just you like to see candidates using whatever tools they have that are helpful to them. And thus far, for whatever reason, the Trump people are not listening to that part of their administration.
I add to Alex's thank you. Let me pile on and also thank you, Arnon.
Thank you, Merrill. Thank you, Alex.
It was a great, insightful conversation. Al Olson in Seattle agrees, thanking us for what he says was an informative and thoughtful conversation. Arnon, will be keeping our eye on Fox and your work over the coming 2 weeks, especially on November 3rd. To our viewers, this was the kind of conversation that Alex and I are very proud of, and please encourage your friends to take a look. I'm stunned at how often people say to me, darn, I couldn't see your show at 6 p.m. Thursday. I was busy doing something else. Well, it's just as good an hour from now on demand as it is right now. So please share with your friends that they can see Arnon Mishkin on YouTube at thenewsproject.net, our site, and in other means. And please tune in and please see the show. We think this is a great conversation that really will inform how you think about the next 10 days and how you'll think about election night. Thank you again, Arnon. Thank you to our viewers. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. We're taking off next Thursday in light of all the attention that'll be focused on the election. But we'll bring you a show on November 5th, probably at this very time. Stay tuned to social media to learn more about when that next program occurs. We'll see you on November 5th. Thank you. Have a good election. Please vote. And thank you for watching the News Project.